It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor?
Good morning, neighbors. Won't you pray with me? Our gracious and loving God, I need you now. I am pretty much nothing without you. And I pray that you would speak to us and through us, and may we come to know you as the one who creates neighbors and neighborhoods. In Jesus' name, amen. This morning, we're going to take a look at what it means not just to love thy neighbor, but to love thy neighborhood. Neighborhoods have become an important part of my life, and I'll share a little bit of that with you. First off, Mr. Rogers. I grew up in elementary school watching him every day at 3 o'clock before the bell rang on PBS. And I think we could all agree that we need a little bit more of Mr. Rogers in our world today. He taught us how to notice people, how to notice the world around us in a very close, personal way. He taught us how to use our imaginations to go to faraway places. And Mr. Rogers knew what it meant to love your neighborhood. So this sermon today is one part of many that many of us will share over the coming months from the book Growing Young. Growing Young is a study, an in-depth study of how churches can grow their younger generation by coming together as all generations. And so the researchers of this book set out to understand what churches are doing this well. Are there churches that are attracting families and youth and young adults, and not only attracting them, but engaging them in the life of the church and in the life of their communities? And so a team of us, as you may know, I went to Arlington, Texas to dive deep into this conversation. And your Edmond Church Board has given the green light for us to move forward in implementing many of these recommendations. And so Growing Young is a big part of where this church is headed. As you will recall from Pastor TJ's sermons previously, there is a wheel of Growing Young. And there are 6 essential strategies that will allow us to build a Jesus-centered community. And I'm just going to hit the highlights here. The first is keychain leadership, which means we give the keys to the next generation. We don't throw them at the next generation. We don't have a retractable keychain where we give it out to them and then we pull it back when we think they're messing things up. No, we actually give them the keys, because many youth and young adults in this church, outside of the church, they work as professionals. They have jobs, they have mortgages, they are in college, they're in graduate school, and sometimes we don't even entrust the basic actual keys to the church to them. And so keychain leadership, having empathy for the issues that this generation deals with. The world is complex, and we have many questions, and what better place to explore those questions than in the church? We take Jesus' message seriously. We don't need to dumb down anything in order to reach the generation. And in fact, youth and young adults are looking to go deeper and to follow Jesus in a very real way. Warm relationships, it's kind of the glue that holds everything together. Cool is the new warm. And so we want to grow a church family experience that is very warm. Prioritizing young people and families everywhere. So wherever there's a ministry in the church, we want to be mentoring the next generation, and not just by age, but by experience in the church. We welcome people all the time of many age groups, and we want to mentor them into the life of the church. And then finally, being the best neighbors, and that's what I'm going to talk with you about today. So how do we be the best neighbors? How do we love and shape our world well? Oftentimes in the church, we have this defensive posture. Like we got to keep the world out, which we do. But that sometimes means we don't even go out into the world to be salt and light. And so the idea is for us to love our world well in a way that actually shapes the culture. We don't want to be negatively influenced by the culture, but we can perhaps make an impact. Going back to our scripture reading from the book of Matthew 22:37-40, Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." What does it really mean to love our neighbor? What does it really mean to love ourselves? Because if we love ourselves, maybe we understand what it means to love our neighbors. More about that later. And on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Sometimes when we use words like culture and world, we think of them in a way that perhaps isn't the most helpful. And I'll talk about that in a second. Isaiah, age 20, he says, "Christianity is about the restoration of how it is all supposed to be. We have been given hope, we have been redeemed, and we have been empowered by the authority of God to go out and change this world." Do you see what 20-year-old Isaiah wants to do in the life of the church? He wants to do this regardless of whether or not the church supports him, whether or not he has a church. He wants to change the world because he feels like that is God's vision for this world. And the church can either support him and mentor him in that or not. I want to tell you about a story of Alexis. Alexis is a young professional working in Washington, D.C. Like many of us, she grew up in the church. And upon graduation from high school, she moved to college. And in college, she put her faith on a shelf. And she started to question some of the beliefs that were given to her. And she didn't necessarily want to be a part of a church. She graduated from college, started working in the DC area in a very influential job. And she decided she wanted to be a part of the community. She wanted to be a part of something good. And so she went to a festival. She didn't go to a church, but she went to a festival that was being held on the National Mall. And at the festival, she encountered a group that was working on recruiting families to foster and adopt. Because like many places, there's a big problem with children being in the foster care system and not having enough families to care for them. And so this group of people was passionate about recruiting families to be involved in any way possible, to actually take in children, to pray for them, to contribute to them in different ways. And she was so compelled by this cause that she decided to be a part of it. Come to find out, this was a ministry of District Church in Washington, D.C. She didn't know they were really from a church at first, but after getting to know them, she couldn't help but see why they were doing what they were doing. They were called by God to do this. Had the church just stayed inside their walls and not cared about going out in the community, she wouldn't have ever found out about this ministry. And so District Church is an example, one of many examples of churches in the Growing Young book that we can model after. So when we talk about the world, sometimes we think about that bad, evil, scary place, which there are so many bad, evil, and scary things that happen in the world. But for working purposes, we're going to define the world as anything that takes place outside the church walls. I mean, we are in the world, right? We do things in the world. And in fact, in John 3:16, we come to understand that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And in John 17, he says, "I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. This is where we get the saying, being in the world, but not of the world. We are definitely in this world, and God has a plan for this world. And what we know from the book of Revelation is that this earth, this world will become brand new. And when we talk about culture, sometimes we're afraid of that too. You know, as Seventh-day Adventists, we have a culture, and it takes some getting used to if you're not used to it. Culture is what we eat, it's how we dress, it's our values, it's our language. And so culture is what we make of the world. And so what we come to understand from churches that grow young is that they know how to balance Christ and culture. Because if you lean too far one way of course, being faithful to Scripture, sometimes we lose our audience because we're not speaking their language. And then sometimes, if you lean too far the other way, if you lean too far on culture, then you lose your message. And so what Jesus taught us, the method that Jesus used was to embody and to incarnate himself in the culture, but transcending it at the same time. So we have to figure out that balance. We have to do that dance as a church. Tim Keller, he's the pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City. He says, all churches must understand, love, and identify with their local community. Understand, love, and identify with their local community and social setting, and yet at the same time, be able and willing to critique and challenge it. There are a lot of things in the world that we can critique and challenge. If we start there, then we might not have anyone that's listening. If you think about how to do ministry in New York City, that's a big place. Where do you start? How can you be relevant? How can you stand out from all the noise and all the crowd? And there's so many people in New York City, but if you break it down, the city is made up of people and of neighborhoods and neighbors. And I think that's one way that we can reach these places. Another characteristic of churches that grow young is they ask the question, who is my neighbor? Do you know who your neighbors are? When I was involved in my neighborhood association a few years ago, we did some training with the Neighborhood Alliance. And they would encourage neighborhoods and neighbors to get to know your neighbors to the left, to the right, and across the street on a first name basis. And if you do that, it's going to build this feeling of community. And if there are concerns, if there are issues that come up, instead of reporting them to code enforcement, maybe you can have a conversation, you know. Maybe they're having trouble bringing their trash can up the driveway. If you have a relationship with them, maybe you come to find out that it's not easy for them to get in and out of the house, you know. Maybe there are some other things going on. So who is our neighbor? If we were to ask that question around our church, who are our neighbors? It's a little different because this is like close to the interstate. You know, we have the neighborhood to the east of us, and we have spent some time getting to know them a bit. I understand there may be some more neighbors moving in across the street with a new development. It's an opportunity for us to ask, who is our neighbor? Tina, 27 years old, she says, our church has more than just a desire to do good. We understand that this good, this need for justice, comes from our understanding of the gospel. It's grounded in who Jesus is, who God is, and what life is all about. So we're not doing this just to have some gimmick to get people in the door. We're not going to go out and do good just because that's a nice method to sort of trick people into coming to our church. We're doing this because it's what God does, and we are participating in the things that God does. Another characteristic of churches that grow young is that they honor what is good. God is all around us, therefore goodness is around us when God is involved. And I had a professor in college who said that all truth is God's truth. So if our quest is to seek and understand the truth, then we shouldn't be afraid of it. Because if it's true, then God made it or he's involved in it. I had another professor who said that Jesus is the way, but there are many ways to Jesus. God speaks in a myriad of ways all over the world. And one of those ways, I think, is among neighbors. From Growing Young, page 241, young people are tired of congregations that define themselves by what they are against rather than what they are for. As Seventh-day Adventists, we're against a few things, right? But we're against them because we're for other things, right? We're against working on the Sabbath because we're in favor of having the Sabbath experience of rest. We're against eating certain types of food, not because we like to be killjoys, but because we want to live a healthful, abundant life. And so what are we for? And I think young people in this room, you might be asking yourself the same question. I've heard all these do's and don'ts. How about more of the do's? Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness, the world and those who dwell therein. Ultimately, God is in control of this earth. He made it. Nobody else did. Another characteristic of churches that grow young is that they make the world better. If we were, and we ask this question a lot, if we were to leave this community, if we were to close our doors, would anybody know the difference? I'm excited about some of the things that Parkview has been doing over the past couple of years, of becoming acquainted with their community and opening their doors to serve needs. And I think now, if Parkview were to leave, there would be a definite difference. And I think this is a challenge for our church. We can't expect everyone to just come here. And I'm praying that God will make me willing to be a part of making this world and this community a better place. Another characteristic of churches that grow young is they respect the journey as much as the destination. So we keep the conversation going. So there are some hot topics, there are some hard issues that our young people are dealing with, that many of you of all ages are dealing with, questions that we don't really have easy answers to. And sometimes young people come to us with those questions. They kind of put themselves out there a little bit, and they try to see how we're going to respond because they're wrestling with this. And they could ask Google, or they could ask YouTube, or they could ask their friends outside the church, but maybe they ask the question here. And do we shut down the conversation? Do we give them a quick answer? And there are times when we might say, you know what, I have some struggles with that perspective. I'm wrestling with it myself. You know, I don't really think that's right. I think there are some unintended and harmful consequences that could come from that lifestyle or that behavior. But you know what? I'm going to pray about it. I'm going to think about it. And I'm going to try to understand how that might make sense to you. And we're going to keep this conversation going. And as a church, we have tried to open up conversations in the past. Pastor TJ did a series on the issue of hell. And we had a question and answer panel. And I think that's the first of many opportunities that we can have to keep the conversation going. So there are a few things that the researchers found that are what not to do when you're trying to be the best neighbors. And this is actually good news for us because it allows us to relax a little bit. So the first thing not to do is to aim for perfection. So the churches that are growing young and the churches that are neighboring well, you know, they don't have it all together. They struggle. They're not always thinking about their community. They're not always doing the best job of mentoring people or understanding what the community needs are. It's a process. But the young people that were interviewed that were a part of these churches, they said, you know what? We don't really care if it's perfect. We see the intention behind what they're doing. We see that they're trying to serve and to get outside and to make a difference. And that's okay. I just want to be a part of a church that's like doing something, you know? The other thing not to do is to copy and compete. You know, there are a lot of places where you can have really great music, really great food, really great social life. The church is really not the best place for those things. I'll just say, like, we can't compete. And even amongst the buffet of churches, especially in the Edmond area, we cannot compete with mega churches. What we have to offer maybe is something different. And so what young people are craving is something real, something authentic, something that is not cookie cutter. And so we don't have to copy what everyone else is doing. We can make it fit for us. Another thing not to do is to condemn and critique. Some of us have the spiritual gift of condemnation, and it usually doesn't go over very well. The ministry of condemnation is not super effective, yet we still do it. We still practice that ministry. But this is a process, and condemning and critiquing ourselves, condemning and critiquing people in the community for being bad or whatever is not the most effective. And so there's some research that shows that criticism actually activates the parts of the brain that register pain. So when someone criticizes us, it feels painful. And so I think what I've learned from that is I really need to be careful with how I give feedback. And there may be some times when even constructive feedback is just too much. And so let's be patient and gentle with our church family. Andy Stanley says the only way to change culture is to create more of it. Sometimes as the church, we're not really adding to the conversation. We're not adding to the culture around us. Nobody knows who we are because we're not adding anything to their experience. So rather than endless debates, let's listen to what is happening in the wider world. And let's ask, what unique contribution can a Christian community make? So whatever the issue is that we're struggling with, what could be our contribution, from a biblical and a spiritual perspective? And finally, what not to do is to find the one right program, cause, or issue. Sometimes we have these committees and we have these teams that get together and we're just trying to find the silver bullet ministry that's going to change everything. And that's not really necessary. Justin, who's 23, says, at our church, everybody has something that they care about. And the church doesn't need to rubber stamp your passion before you can do it. All of us have passions. All of us have communities and neighborhoods that we're a part of. And the church doesn't have to support financially everything that you want to do. I am much more excited about the organic process of God speaking to us and us sharing that passion with our church family and then moving forward in whatever way makes sense. Maybe it's just one of us going out and being a part of something special and then coming back and telling the story of how God was involved in that ministry. Maybe it's 2 or 3 of us develop some kind of a small group that cares about this particular issue and we want to make a difference. Or maybe it's something that the whole church gets involved with. There's a metaphor for people who like to explore and exploring caves. And sometimes it's rather than allowing the freedom and adventure of exploring a new cave or a new territory, sometimes we stifle that and we say, no, it's got to be this way. The church is leading us in this direction and you need to follow exactly what we're doing, lockstep. But I think God is leading and speaking to us in a variety of ways. And so churches that grow young, they recognize that we need to foster that sense of how is God speaking to you? And what can we as a church do to support that? All right, so to summarize, churches that grow young, they know how to balance Christ and culture. They ask, who is my neighbor? They honor what is good. They make the world better, and they respect the journey. The Christmas market, a week from tomorrow, December 2nd, is not just like a fun Christmas activity. It is an opportunity to welcome our neighbors, to be neighborly, and to have conversations and to do things that we wouldn't normally get to do, to help people feel like they can come to this place. I keep doing that. To come to this place and be a part of the holiday season, to support people whose passion is to make things that are meaningful and useful. And so I just wanted to highlight the Christmas market as an opportunity for us to be good neighbors and to welcome people from this community. So I want to tell you a little bit of my story. I told you at the beginning that neighborhoods are a big part of my life. So when we bought our first home, we lived in a neighborhood that didn't have a homeowners association because a lot of the folks rent. So it was an older mid-century neighborhood. And there was a neighborhood association that was active many years ago, but it was inactive. And so over time, I got to think, well, how can we build a sense of community here? How can we make things better? And so I met a gentleman who is an artist, and he happened to live a few blocks away from me. And he actually reached out to me because I had put something out online about, looking for folks in the neighborhood who have some history of the neighborhood association. And he saw that, and he said, yeah, let's get together and let's do something. And so we actually made flyers, and we planned kind of like a jumpstart meeting to get everyone together and to see what we wanted to do. And so we met at the local elementary school, and we had 60 people show up just with passing out flyers. And by the end of that meeting, we had reorganized the neighborhood association, and we had subcommittees of teams that were going to focus on beautification and safety and marketing. And it was really exciting. And for the next 3 years of my life, I served in leadership of that neighborhood association. And my confession is that experience was just as fulfilling, if at times not more fulfilling, than my work here in the church. And I say that because sometimes the church can take up all of our time to where we don't actually have time to do things like that. And I felt like God was leading us to have this sense of community and this sense of place in our little neighborhood. And so I believe that God works in the church and in our spheres of influence. Maybe you're involved maybe you're a business owner. Maybe you're a supervisor at your workplace. Those are all opportunities where God can lead us. And so during my journey of being the president of the Skyline Neighborhood Association, I met a gentleman named Gene Lemons. And he ended up being in charge of our neighborhood newsletter. And he would ride his bike. He couldn't drive. He was disabled. And he delivered to each of the 500 residences in our neighborhood at the time. He hand-delivered every newsletter every month. And he taught me a lot about what it means to love your neighbor. And at this time, I'm going to share you a video of his story.
Jim Gardner and Bob Mills, Sky News 9 HD, were in the air following a bicycle versus car accident in northwest Oklahoma City a week ago. Well, now we are learning the victim has passed away. And new tonight, those who knew him say he leaves behind a unique legacy. News 9's Steve Shaw has his story.
Gene Lemons couldn't drive, so he rode a bike. He carved out a hardscrabble living detailing cars, mowing lawns, whatever it took to be self-sufficient. But Gene's karate teacher says Lemons was much more than that. That's right, I said karate.
He had such a passion for things, and not just martial arts, but everything he did.
Have you ever had a more enthusiastic student?
I have not. No, I have not.
Gene Lemons' biggest passion was his church, Putnam City Baptist Church. They moved 7 miles away from Gene's neighborhood 15 years ago, but they never lost Gene. Even though he had a thick speech impediment, Lemons sang in the choir. He was the official church photographer. He also grabbed on to senior pastor Bill Hulse's heart and never let go.
Never an agenda, never an issue, never dissension, just always putting other people first. And that's what Jesus told us to do, was to love God and then love your neighbor. And he said that's really what Christianity is all about. It's that simple, just those two key things. And he was passionate about his God, and he was passionate about other people. And it was the purest form of Christianity I've seen in my ministry.
Friends tell me Gene was riding his bike home from a Dunkin' Donuts Bible study last Monday when he was critically injured in this accident. Neighbor Steve Davis saw Gene on his bike that morning.
If I'd have just said something, talked to him, it might have added 15 seconds to his trip, which may have avoided all this.
That was our Steve Shaw reporting. Gene Lemon sounds like quite a guy. His funeral will be at 10 a.m. Friday at his beloved Putnam City Baptist Church.
Take control of your health.
I had the privilege of visiting Gene in the ICU and when he was unconscious, and I talked to him and I prayed with him. And Lynette and I attended his funeral at Putnam City Baptist, and I'm guessing there were 400 people there. It was packed. And I knew that our neighborhood would never be the same without him. And so he's just one example of someone who took the message of Jesus seriously, and he loved his neighbors and his neighborhood. Going back to Matthew 22, Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." And as we close, I want us to think about what it means to love our neighbor. Eric, if you could bring up thank you. If we love ourselves, that means that we take time to bathe, to clothe ourselves, to eat, to go to work. We understand what our hopes and dreams are, what our needs are, and we pay attention to that. So right now in this moment, I want you to think about your neighbors. What are their needs? What are they worrying about? And how can we be a part of loving them and building a sense of community in our own neighborhoods? And now thinking about this Edmond Church and this place where we are at I-35 in Danforth. I think one of the biggest ministries that we have as a church is a place for them to safely park their car when they have car trouble. A gentleman had car trouble this week. They were traveling for Thanksgiving from North Dakota, and he had to leave his car here for a few days. And he called us and let us know, don't tow it away. That's one way that we can neighbor well, is to be that place where they can safely park their car. And so I pray that you will consider what it means to love your neighbor and to love your neighborhood in a way that you haven't thought of before. Maybe you get home from work and you go straight into the garage and into the house. Maybe you have a front porch that you never use. Maybe you don't walk the dog enough, but I encourage you to get out and get to know your neighbors. It takes just a wave and a smile to talk about what's going on in their life and how can we get together more often. It's a lost art in this society. I pray that we will come to transform this community and the culture around us for Jesus. Would you pray with me? God, we thank you for the ways that you were a good neighbor to those around you when you were here on this earth. You have called us to mix and mingle with people, to invite them to come and see, to taste and see that you are good. And Lord, sometimes as a church, we just like to play it safe. You know, we just stay inside, and out of fear of the unknown, fear of the bad things of this world, sometimes we stay in the salt shaker and we don't get out as salt and light. So I pray that you would go with us now and you would teach us what it means to follow you to the utmost and to be the best neighbors. For I ask in Jesus' name, amen.